y'all. Welcome to Killer Queens, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, Torella, and like most millennials, I've always had an obsession with true crime. On KQ, you'll find light true crime stories, millennial hypes and gripes, some adult language, and maybe a special guest here and there. Just like a 90s sleepover, we're just a couple BFFs hanging out. So gather round and let's launch right into it. This episode contains discussions of domestic violence, physical and emotional abuse, strangulation, stabbing, and gun violence. Listener discretion is advised. Charles Joseph Whitman, known infamously as the Texas Tower Sniper, shocked the world on August 1st, 1966, when he climbed to the top of the University of Texas Tower in Austin and opened fire on the public below. By the time his rampage was stopped, 16 people were dead and 31 others were wounded. While his final act of violence and its aftermath are well documented, the early life of Charles Whitman offers critical insights into the forces that shaped him into the man he became. Was there something in Whitman's background, his upbringing, and the pressures he faced that can provide context for his tragic descent into madness? Spoiler alert, the answer is yes. We gonna get into it though. First, of course, I do want to give a hey girl thanks to Marky Mark on both occasions. I don't see that it was requested by anybody, so maybe Mark also requested it. He and I talked about this case a little bit, but I didn't ask him that question. So anyway, thanks, girl. We love you. All right, shall we start? Charles Whitman was born on June 24th, 1941 in Lake Worth, Florida, to Charles Adolphus Whitman Sr. and Margaret Whitman. Adolphus is a hell of a fucking name. Middle name, but still. The eldest of three boys, Charles was raised in a strict Roman Catholic household. I'll just let you make an assumption about where this is going with that, and you would be right, unfortunately. Margaret was a devout Roman Catholic, although this is not a mommy issues thing. So if you're thinking that, not. But she was a devout Roman Catholic. She raised her three boys in the faith, often attending Mass. All three boys did serve as altar boys at the Sacred Heart Roman Catholic Church in Lake Worth. His father, Charles Sr., was a domineering and abusive figure, while his mother was a loving yet passive woman who struggled to shield her children from their father's wrath. Charles Sr. was a self-proclaimed authoritarian. So cute for him. We love it. Not very mindful, not very demure, who expected nothing less than perfection from his sons. He was known to discipline them harshly, often resorting to physical punishment. Despite his father's harsh treatment, Charles did excel in various activities as a child. He was very intelligent. He was curious. He had a natural aptitude for learning. People described him as very polite, a very obedient child who seldom lost his temper. That's very interesting because he loses his temper in the worst fucking way later, you know? So like when he is under his father's watchful eye, he is literally doing everything that he can to stay within the confines, presumably to not get beat. I mean, I read something somewhere, or maybe somebody said this to me, but anyway, I used to work at a hair salon, and there was this woman that would come in to get her hair done, and she had 4 children, and they waddled in behind her like little ducks, and they would go and they would sit down and they would sit quietly. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just sat. Sometimes they'd read, but other than that, they just sat. You would not know they were there unless you were looking at them. And I said something one time about like, wow, those kids are like so well behaved. Like, you know, I was like in my early 20s and I was like, oh, she, you know, obviously wow, what a great mom. Like they're so well behaved. And the woman I was working with was like, kids, these were little kids too. And she's getting her hair cut and colored, y'all. You know, that's like 1.5 2 hour appointment. And she's like, little kids aren't supposed to sit that still for that long, really. Like, she was like, I feel like they're hard on those kids. Like, that's that's a sign that somebody is being really hard on them and they're afraid to step out of line rather than, oh my gosh, these kids are perfect. You're the perfect mom. Like, yeah, they need to learn to behave when they're in public, of course, but they're also still little kids. Little kids are noisy and jumpy. Like they move and they make noise, like, and they're supposed to. And I was like, oh, and that's what I feel like here, where they're like, he's so polite. He's so obedient. Like, I was polite. I was very obedient as well. But I also did not want to get in trouble if I wasn't. And this is on a much, much worse scale. I just feel like as other adults, we take that as a sign of like, quote, good parenting. But to know what was going on behind closed doors, that gives you a little more context, right? By the age of 6, he reportedly had a measured IQ of 139, a score that indicated that he was gifted. And Mark added here, typically a score of this level indicates that someone has superior reasoning, problem solving, and verbal skills. A score this high would put someone in the top 2% of the population in terms of general intelligence. While IQ is not a complete measure of a person's overall abilities, it does suggest a high level of intellectual potential and capability. His academic success and sharp intellect were sources of pride for his father, of course, who saw Charles as a reflection of his own ambitions. Of course. However, the pressure to meet his father's high expectations created significant emotional strain on young Charles. And of course it did. And that carried into his adulthood, which we are going to see. In addition to excelling academically, Charles also demonstrated an early talent for music, particularly the piano, which his mother did encourage because she kind of saw it as a way for Charles to escape basically his father, like in his actual life. Like he could sit, he could do that, it could take his mind off of it. And typically, I guess if he was playing piano, his father wasn't beating him. So that was a plus for him. Charles also participated in the Boy Scouts, and he did advance to become an Eagle Scout at the age of 12. And at the time, he was the youngest to ever achieve the rank of Eagle Scout. This achievement was another source of pride for his father, who saw it as further evidence of Charles's potential. And he thought, everybody can see what a good parent I am because look at what my kid did. That is me. That is all me. Oh my God, gotta love Charles Sr. Adolphus. Charles Sr. was an avid firearms collector and enthusiast. From an early age, each of the boys were exposed to guns, and they were taught how to shoot and gun safety. And this was something that Charles Sr. really enjoyed, and he enjoyed spending time with his sons, I don't know why, teaching them how to break down their guns and clean and maintain them properly. I think really what he enjoyed was doing that stuff, and his kids doing it too. I don't know that he actually enjoyed spending time with them because he seemed to hate them every other time, but I digress. Charles shined when it came to shooting. He was described as a crack marksman from a young age. His father said that by the time he was 16, he could, oh my God, and I quote, could plug the eye out of a squirrel. That's disgusting. They would go on hunting trips together, something they all enjoyed, and this furthered Charles's love of marksmanship. But beneath the surface, the young boy was struggling with the weight of his father's expectations and the instability of his home life. The Whitman household was characterized by tension and conflict. Charles Sr. was a successful plumbing contractor, but as I mentioned, at home, he demanded strict obedience. His word was the law in their household. His volatile temper often led to violent outbursts, particularly toward his wife. Margaret Whitman endured years of abuse at the hands of her husband, but she stayed in the marriage for like a lot of reasons, right? This is the 50s, 60s. The fuck else is she going to do? She literally can't do anything. Like, she can't get a house by herself. She can't, she could have gotten a job. But there were a lot of banks that wouldn't even let women open their own bank accounts. Like, what else was she going to do? She was stuck. The constant turmoil at home took a toll on Charles and his younger brothers, Patrick and John, where fear and anxiety were literally ever present, right? The impact of this dysfunctional family dynamic on Charles was profound. While he appeared to be well-adjusted and a successful young man to outsiders, he harbored deep-seated anger and resentment toward his father. Charles's relationship with his mother was more complex. He adored her, and he often sought to protect her from his father's abuse, but he was frustrated by her inability to leave the toxic marriage, which I do understand that, especially as a kid in the situation. You can't understand why. And there's so much that goes into that. And then again, at that time, it's so much easier. And I'm not saying it's easy, but financially and just societally acceptable, it's easier for women to live independently from a man. But at that time, it was not. I mean, it just, and it still is not easy today. It's just a little easier than 60 years ago. This internal conflict would later manifest in troubling ways as Charles struggled to reconcile his love for his mother with his anger toward his father. In high school, Charles was seen to be a popular student. He had a paper route, which he'd been running since he was 12, and he managed to save his money from that to buy himself a Harley Davidson. He graduated in June of 1959, seventh in his class of 72. But about a month before the graduation, he and some friends went out to celebrate, and Charles came home drunk. He was outside. His father found him and began to beat him mercilessly. When the beating stopped, Charles Sr. grabbed Charles Jr. and threw him into the family swimming pool. Whitman told one of his close friends that this incident was the catalyst that sparked his plans for after high school graduation. That's horrific. That's horrific. Can you give your child a consequence for doing something they're not supposed to do? Absolutely 100%. Almost killing them? There's literally no excuse. It's awful. At the age of 18, Charles wanted to get away, and he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. His decision to join the military was motivated by, obviously, he wanted some independence. He wanted to prove himself outside the shadow of his father and really just get away from the abuse of his father. In July 1959, he left home to begin his training at Parris Island, South Carolina, and his dad did not know. His father did not find out. He didn't tell him until he was gone, on his way to basic. So Charles is traveling to start his military career. His father finds out, and he calls a branch of the government to try to have his son's enlistment canceled, but he wasn't successful. Give it up, bro. He's 18. Too bad, so sad. You missed it, man. Worst. The military provided Charles with the structure and discipline he had known all his life, but it also exposed him to new challenges and stressors. During Charles's initial 18-month enlistment, he earned a sharpshooter's badge and the Marine Corps Expeditionary Medal. This medal was established in May of 1919 as the Marine Corps Expeditionary Ribbon. A full-size medal was authorized in March of 1921, and the Expeditionary Medal is therefore one of the oldest medals in the United States military, which is still issued to active duty personnel. And to be awarded the Marine Corps Expeditionary Medal, a Marine must have engaged in a landing on foreign territory, participated in combat operations against an opposing force, or participated in a designated operation for which no other service medal is authorized. So, there you have it. One thing that made Whitman immediately stand out from his fellow Marines was his ability to shoot. And remember, this was also one of the only activities that his brothers and their father enjoyed doing with one another. Whether it was shooting targets or going hunting, it was likely one of the few times when the boys weren't berated or made to feel like they didn't stack up to their father's ideal of what they should be. Records of Whitman's shooting test in the Marines showed that he hit 215 out of a possible 250 targets. They also showed that he excelled at shooting from long distances, which is oh, that's good for you. Wow. And then later it's oh, Jesus, that's terrible. And he seemed to even be more accurate when a target was moving. Yikes. Whitman became focused on excelling as a Marine, which he felt would open doors for himself professionally and personally once he was out of the military. He also continued to excel academically while in the Marines. He was selected to attend the Naval Enlisted Science Education Program, a prestigious program that offered enlisted Marines the opportunity to also earn a college degree. And it seemed like a tailor-made program for Whitman. It was basically a scholarship program that would send enlisted men to study to become an engineer. Then they could go back to the Marines and they'd become an officer. In 1961, he enrolled at the University of Texas at Austin to study mechanical engineering after passing a competitive exam and then going before a committee to be selected. His tuition and his books were all paid for by the Marines, and he was given an extra $250 a month. However, balancing the demands of his military duties with his academic responsibilities was difficult. He was struggling with his coursework, and he started to experience really severe bouts of anxiety and depression. At this point, Whitman had been in the regimented life of the Marines for a while. So when he was at college, he started to have free time. Like he could do whatever he wanted with this time. He did not have to, he wasn't reporting somewhere all day, every day, right? And unfortunately, it didn't take him long to get in trouble. He and some friends were arrested for poaching deer. He also started to get into gambling and racked up huge gambling debts with various bookies around the area. And when they came looking for their money, he refused to pay, which feels bold to me. Like that's a bold move, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off. I guess it kind of did, but like, won't bookies like fucking hurt you if you don't pay them? I don't know. I've seen The Town. Like, God, that would scare me. Anyway, his grades while he was in school were unimpressive. They did improve slightly after he married his girlfriend, Kathy Leisner, but the Marine Corps was not going to stand for his actions, his behavior at the school, his poor grades, all of that. So they revoked his scholarship. And then he was returned to active duty in February of 1963. He was stationed at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, but after his year and a half of freedom, he was having trouble going back to the military regimented structured life, right? He told people that the constant discipline and structure was oppressive. Also, his wife was still in Texas finishing her degree, and he was really lonely. He tried to appeal that withdrawal of his scholarship, but that appeal was denied. Whitman was also informed that because of his actions while at the school, that the time that he spent there would no longer count against his agreed upon enlistment time. So this led him to resent the Marine Corps even more, and he really didn't even try to hide that. In November of 1963, he was court-martialed for gambling again, as well as possession and use of a non-military pistol. He had threatened a fellow soldier who owed him a debt of $30 plus interest. Well, well, well. Aren't we the kettle? Wait, aren't we the pot calling the kettle black? Didn't you refuse to pay when you racked up quote unquote huge gambling debts? And I know $30 in 1963 is way more than it is now. Very interesting. We can dish it out, but we can't take it in, can we? He was found guilty and he was sentenced to 30 days confinement and 90 days hard labor. A promotion he had received upon his return to active duty was stripped from him. Lance Corporal Whitman was once again Private Whitman, and he was desperate to be free of the Marine Corps. So he turned to his father for help. Charles Sr. had made connections in his years as a prominent businessman, and he set about trying to pull strings to get his son's enlistment time reduced. It was reduced by a year, and in December of 1964, he was honorably discharged from the Marines. However, now he has, quote unquote, failed as a Marine. He, quote unquote, failed at school. And so this is massively embarrassing to him. So he returns to Austin, but he wants to make up for this. So he re-enrolled and he changed his focus to architectural engineering from mechanical engineering. He had a steady job as a teller with a local bank, and in his free time, he volunteered with the local Boy Scouts as a scoutmaster. He also kept journals in which he constantly wrote about ways to improve himself. Honestly, this kind of broke my heart because he would write reminders for himself like, don't nag, be courteous, be kind, be gentle. He's literally trying to talk himself out of engaging in the behavior that was modeled for him, because what comes naturally to him is the opposite of those things at this point. And he seemed like he knew he had a problem. He knew he couldn't overcome it. But I do think that he tried. I absolutely 100% do not condone any of the actions that he took, but he did try to seek help. And I think that I would hope, had this case happened in today's world, with the fact that he was trying to get help, that it never would have gotten to anyone dying. Because I hope that he would have received that help. But in 1960s, he didn't. It just wasn't there. And it wasn't seen that way. And he's a man, and get over it and suck it up, right? So he's writing all these notes to himself to seemingly try to not follow in his father's footsteps, but he still did anyway, and he ended up becoming violent with his wife, Kathy. So Kathy was a teacher at Lanier High School in Austin, and she was the main breadwinner in the house, something that was always at the forefront of Whitman's thoughts. So her salary paid for the things that they needed, and she also had health insurance for both of them through her work. And outwardly, like, everybody who interacted with them was like, oh, they seem like they have the perfect marriage, and they seem so happy, and everything seems great. He's a devoted husband, he's a hard worker, all this stuff. But inwardly, he was completely full of self-hatred. He despised being a, quote, freeloader, even though he did accept pretty constantly expensive gifts from his father. In his eyes, being overweight was a sign of weakness, but he could never get himself back into the same shape he was in while he served in the Marines. And like, while that idea of the man has to provide and the man has to be the breadwinner and all this stuff, it hurts everybody, right? But like, he has that constantly on him, that he's supposed to provide, he's supposed to do this, he's supposed to do that, but his wife is making more money than him. And that is constantly, for him, seen as a failure. And I'm sure his dad was making little comments. I can't imagine that his dad didn't say anything to him about it. He was, discharged from the military. His promotion was stripped from him. He lost his scholarship. He couldn't finish school. Like, all of those things, you start hearing these things and you immediately think family annihilator. Immediately, because those are the things that we see in family annihilators. And I actually looked up and I found an article that kind of talked about the ties between patriarchy, patriarchal society, societal expectations of men, pressures of men, and family annihilators. This says every 5 days, a person murders his family. It says, according to an analysis by the Indianapolis Star, 94% of the time that killer is a man, 86% of the time he uses a gun, and 84% of the time his victim is a woman. A distinct profile emerged from the Indy Star investigation and other research. The family annihilators' violent actions are rooted in their failures, insecurities, and inability to control their fate. Circumstances, such as impending divorce, financial difficulties, illness, have robbed them of the life they had imagined, so they decide to take the lives of those closest to them. It's just one of those things where it's like there's so much pressure, and that sense of it has to be me, I have to be the leader, I have to be in charge, I have to be the provider, I have to make the most money, or else it's seen as weakness. And like for Charles Whitman, he had gained some weight. He felt like that was a sign of weakness. It doesn't matter what anybody else is telling you. That was completely ingrained in him. And you can absolutely see how that got there, because look at his father, right? And whether or not he wants to believe that, it's ingrained in him. And Kathy was very supportive of him. She was noticing that he was getting, like, his outlook was just getting worse and worse. And she really started getting, like, she really started talking to him about, like, going to see a counselor. Maybe you should talk to somebody. She was really, really supportive and kind and gentle with him from all accounts. I mean, obviously, I wasn't there. But that's kind of the way everybody talks about it, and he writes about that in his journals, that she really, really tried to get him to go seek help. And during this time, his mom and dad end up getting into another violent fight, and his mom, Margaret, finally left his father, and then she moves to Austin with one of his brothers. She ended up filing for divorce, and this really affected Charles's mental health as well. So it kind of continued to spiral downward from there. But in the spring of 1966, Kathy finally convinced him to talk with someone. So he ends up being prescribed Valium, and then he was referred to a psychiatrist, Dr. Heath, who said that he, quote, had something about him that suggested and expressed the all-American boy, but that he, quote, seemed to be oozing with hostility. Sometimes Whitman would say in their sessions that he wanted to go to the top of a tower with the deer rifle and start shooting people. Not a tower, sorry, the tower. And the tower is a 307-foot tall clock tower on the UT Austin campus. For whatever reason, Dr. Heath was not alarmed by Whitman bringing this up, because he said several of his patients would mention the tower when talking with him. It was an important symbol to the locals, and it represented the Texas pride that they have for their community. Okay, I get that other people might mention the tower. Or do you mean they mention the tower like they're going to go jump off the tower? Or do you mean they mention the tower like, I'm going to go to the top of the tower and shoot people, and nobody else ever did it, so you didn't think he would do it? I don't understand that. He's just like, well, I mean, people talk about the tower all the time. It really didn't set off any alarm bells. He called it what he thought as idle threats. He didn't think anything was going to happen. Okay. Also, everyone in his life thought he's under a lot of pressure. He's got a lot going on. They didn't realize that his like ramblings and musings and like his thoughts, the things he talked about, all of those things, like the things that were keeping his attention, were getting more and more violent. On July 31st, 1966, Whitman purchased a Bowie knife and a set of binoculars from a local surplus store. He then picked up Kathy from her summer job, and the couple went to a movie and met his mom for a late lunch. After lunch, they stopped by to visit with some friends who said that Whitman seemed unusually quiet, but nothing really out of the ordinary. He was just quiet. And that could just be like, oh, I had a rough day. Oh, I'm tired. Whatever. At 6 p.m., Whitman dropped Kathy off at Southwestern Bell for an evening shift. He was home by 6:45 p.m. when he sat down and typed out a letter explaining the actions he was about to take. Quote, I don't quite understand what it is that compels me to type this letter. Perhaps it is to leave some vague reason for the actions I have recently performed. He's writing this as if he's already done all this, by the way. Like, he hasn't done it yet. He went on to say he'd increasingly been a victim of, quote, many unusual and irrational thoughts, and that his attempt to get help with his problems had failed. He requested that an autopsy be performed to see if there was anything found that could explain his actions or the severe headaches he had been suffering from in the recent months. And he did see a doctor about these headaches as well. And they said, I don't know, man. Figure it out. I don't know what it is. What do you think it is? I don't know. As he continued, he outlined his plan for the coming 24 hours. This is very disturbing. He said, quote, it was after much thought that I decided to kill my wife, Kathy, tonight after I pick her up from work at the telephone company. The prominent reason in my mind is that I truly do not consider this world worth living in, and I am prepared to die, and I do not want to leave her to suffer alone in it. Similar reasons provoked me to take my mother's life also. Around 9:30 p.m., Whitman picked up Kathy from work, and they returned home. Kathy talked on the phone for a while, then Whitman called his mom to see if they could stop by and hang out at her apartment because it had air conditioning and theirs did not. She agreed, but Kathy did not go, and instead she went to bed. I'm sure she was exhausted. Also, is she a teacher and she's working at the telephone company at night? Jeez. She agreed. Oh, sorry. I already said that. So Whitman leaves to go to Margaret's around midnight. What did he think? I'm sorry. What did he think Kathy was going to work all day and then be like, yeah, let's go hang out at your mom's at fucking midnight? So Margaret greeted Whitman in the lobby of the building, and they went up to her apartment. The exact events of what happened are not known, but what has been pieced together and believed to be the likely events is the following. Once in the apartment, Whitman attacked his mother and used a piece of rubber hose to strangle her from behind. God, can you imagine how scary that would be? When she was rendered unconscious, he stabbed her in the chest with the knife that he had purchased the day before. There was also damage to the back of her head, but it's unknown what caused that. He put his mother's body on her bed and covered it with sheets. He wrote a note and left it beside her bed. Quote, I have just taken my mother's life. I'm very upset over having done it. I'm truly sorry that this is the only way I could see to relieve her sufferings, but I think it was best. He then wrote a second note and posted it to her door with the intention of delaying the discovery of her body. It was to the, quote, houseman of the apartments, maybe like a maintenance person, janitor or something who would go around and collect trash and stuff like that. In the note, it said, quote, Roy, I don't have to be to work today and was up late last night. I would like to get some rest. Please do not disturb me. Thank you, Mrs. Whitman. He left around 1:30 a.m., but he returned shortly after telling the doorman that he needed to get into his mom's apartment to get a prescription he promised to fill for her. It's believed that he had left a bottle of Dexedrine. I'm not sure what that is, something he had been taking himself to keep himself awake. I'm not sure how to say it. He returned to the lobby about 5 minutes later and left the apartment building around 2 a.m. He then goes back home. He goes into the bedroom. He pulls the covers down and quickly stabbed Kathy 5 times. And it's believed that she never even woke up. Gosh. He returned to the note he typed earlier and wrote, 3 a.m., both dead. Jeez. He continued to explain why he was doing all this. He wrote letters to each of his brothers and his father. He asked that Kathy's dog be given to her parents. Then he set about making preparations for the next step in his plan. Whitman meticulously prepared for a violent event by packing an array of supplies into his old Marine footlocker. He brought a radio, 3 gallons of water, gasoline, a notebook and pen, a compass, a hatchet, a hammer, food, 2 knives, a flashlight and batteries, and various other implements, which made it clear that he was prepared for a lengthy standoff. He was going to be able to eat, drink, do whatever he needed to do for an extended period of time. He also brought lots of guns, lots of ammo. He was going to be set up there as long as he could. On the morning of the incident, he made calls to excuse his wife and mother from work, then gathered more supplies, including additional firearms. After modifying a shotgun by cutting the barrel off, Whitman donned blue coveralls, loaded his footlocker, and headed to a university campus. Whitman arrived at the campus at 11:30 a.m., using his research assistant ID to obtain a loading zone permit from a security guard. And then he parked, unloaded his equipment, and entered the tower unnoticed, disguised in those blue coveralls. It looked like he was supposed to be there, and it looked like he was doing work there. He told the security guard he had to deliver teaching equipment, and that's why he had this big, footlocker thing or whatever. After taking the elevator to the 27th floor, which initially did not work, and he thought, well, this is over before it started. If I can't get up there on the elevator, I can't go because that's 27 fucking floors. A woman that was working there saw him in the coveralls and again assumed that he was there to work and deliver something. And she did something and got the elevator working. And he said to her, you don't know how happy you've just made me. Yikes. So he goes up the elevator to the 27th floor, but then he had to manually haul the footlocker up the last 3 flights of stairs. Edna Townsley was the receptionist on duty to supervise the observation deck that morning. Whitman hit her on the back of the head. He hit her again after she fell, and then he dragged her across the room and behind a couch. She was still alive, but she was unconscious. He ended up shooting her later, and she does pass away. At around 11:50 a.m., Cheryl Botts and Don Walden entered the reception area from the observation deck, and they found Whitman leaning over the couch holding 2 guns. You guys, listen to this. I don't know if this was normal at this watchtower or clock tower, but they see this man holding guns. And they look at him and they're like, top of the morning to you. And he's like, yep, you too, whatever. And they said, seemed kind of weird. There were some dark stuff on the floor, which was Edna's blood. But they weren't really immediately alarmed because they thought he was just up there shooting pigeons. Can you just do that? Can you just be like, oh, I'm just up here shooting the pigeons? Is that a normal thing? He didn't shoot them. He watched them get on the elevator and off they went. MJ and Mary Gabor and their sons, Mark and Mike, were on the steps going up toward the observation deck with Marguerite and William Lamport when they encountered a barricaded door. And it's blocked by the desk. They really wanted to get to this observation deck because they were moving the desk from behind the door. Like they were like pushing and trying to get the desk out of the way. And then Whitman just starts firing his sawed-off shotgun. Mark Gabor was killed instantly, while Marguerite Lamport was also killed. Mary Gabor and her son Mike were critically wounded. The survivors, William Lamport and MJ Gabor, fled to get help. On the lower floors of the tower, panic spread and people began to barricade themselves in rooms. And as that was unfolding, Whitman began to unpack his supplies. He wedged the door to the observation deck shut, and then he opened fire. In quick succession, Whitman fired off shots. The first struck 18-year-old Claire Wilson in the abdomen. She was pregnant at the time, and the bullet did kill her baby. As she lay on the ground, the man she was with, Thomas Ekman, turned to see what happened, and he was shot in the chest, dying instantly. This is just so terrifying because you're sitting there and it's all happening so fast. And so she gets shot, and he turns and he's like, oh my gosh, what happened? Are you okay? What happened? It's not even registering to him that somebody is shooting, and then boom, he's hit. That's just terrifying. And his body ends up falling on top of Claire's. Nearby, a visiting physics professor, Dr. Robert Hamilton Boyer, was shot in the lower back and quickly passed away. To the east of the tower, Peace Corps trainee Thomas Ashton was shot in the chest and later died at Brackenridge Hospital. As more people around the tower were shot, those in nearby buildings began to notice. Wounded victims lay helpless in the oppressive 95-degree heat, afraid to move for fear of being shot again. Around noon, University police arrived at the tower and reached the 27th floor, where they found the injured Gabor and Lamport families. An order was given to secure the exits and shut off the elevators. Uncertain of how many shooters were involved, authorities feared that there might be multiple gunmen based on the flood of calls coming in to both the Austin police and University police. At this time, Whitman was still moving around the observation deck with nobody stopping him. He looked west towards a busy street with businesses known as The Drag, and began to fire. Alex Hernandez, a boy delivering newspapers on his bicycle, was shot first, followed by Karen Griffin, who died a week later. Thomas Carr was shot in the back as he appeared to be rendering aid to Karen, and he died within an hour. People rushed into the businesses that lined the road and moved away from any windows. Austin police were arriving on campus and trying to make their way to the tower. Officers Jerry Culp and Billy Speed were huddled with others under a statue south of the tower and kind of, trying to plan their next move. Whitman shot Billy Speed through a 6-inch space between two pillars, which were part of a rail that surrounded the statue. Though Speed's wound looked superficial initially to those around him, it was, in fact, grave. This guy, remember how good of a shot he was? And he's even better when people are moving? That is so detrimental here. He was able to get in that, Billy Speed, for all intents and purposes, should have been protected. But he found that 6-inch space and hit him. It's insane. The violence on the drag persisted as Whitman shot Harry Walchuk, a doctoral student and father of 6, who died instantly. Nearby high school students Paul Sontag, Claudia Rutt, and Carla Sue Wheeler took cover behind a construction barricade. When Paul looked out to see what was happening, he was shot in the mouth. Claudia was also struck and later died at Brackenridge Hospital. This is just terrible. As word was spreading about the shooting, police and armed citizens began firing back at the tower, attempting to hit Whitman whenever he appeared over the ledge of the tower. Now, the police initially showed up with pistols. So there were citizens coming up with whatever guns they could find and just trying to shoot him and hit him in some way. Hundreds of shots were fired, but Whitman made himself nearly impossible to target by shooting through the rain spouts and frequently switching guns. Although most of the killing had occurred in the first 20 minutes, Whitman did continue shooting. over 500 yards away. City electricians Solon McCown and Roy Dell Schmidt took cover behind cars with a group of reporters and spectators, and thinking they were completely out of range, Schmidt stood up to see what was going on and was fatally shot in the abdomen as soon as he stood up. Over 500 yards away. As more victims fell, police officers converged on the tower. Officers Jerry Day, Houston McCoy, Ramiro Martinez, and others, along with civilian Alan Crum, reached the 27th floor, where they found and evacuated the wounded Gabor family. Martinez and Crum then carefully moved up to the observation deck, followed by McCoy and Day. With no clear plan, they improvised as they went. So Martinez forced open the barricaded door to the deck, and the men took positions watching the windows. Martinez and McCoy crawled toward the northwest corner where the shots were coming from. As Whitman attempted to change positions, Crum accidentally misfired, forcing Whitman back to the northwest corner. Martinez reached the northeast corner and fired his .38 at Whitman, who tried to return fire but couldn't react in time. McCoy then shot Whitman twice in the head with a shotgun, knocking him down. And then Martinez grabbed the shotgun and fired into Whitman's body at close range, ensuring that he was dead by 1:24 p.m. In just over 90 minutes, Charles Whitman had rained down carnage on the area surrounding the clock tower. It was immediately broadcast nationally. Kathy's father heard Charles's name on the radio and called the police to check on Kathy. When the officers arrived, they looked through a window and saw her body in the bed. They made entrance into the house via the window and discovered that Kathy had been dead for some time. They read the note that Whitman left and immediately went to his mother's apartment, where they also found Margaret. And it quickly became known that Whitman had been seeing a psychiatrist. And you know what? I think I said Heath twice, and I think it's Heatley. Heath just came into my brain, y'all. Sorry about that. Dr. Heatley released the recordings of his sessions with Whitman. He was under intense scrutiny when it was discovered that Whitman had made mention of shooting people from the tower. But he was quickly cleared of any responsibility because the general consensus was, he did the best he could with the information he was given. Nothing else about Whitman suggested that he would do what he did. So Heatley didn't consider himself a threat to himself or others. Didn't consider him a threat to himself or others. Well, what do you mean, though? Because he said, though, that that's what he wanted to do. Do you only have responsibility if they say, I am going to do that? Because I think he mentioned it a lot. I don't know. Whitman's father authorized an autopsy to be performed on his body, because remember, he did ask for that in his letter. During the autopsy, there was a tumor discovered. I've read pecan-sized, I've read walnut-sized, I don't know. But this was a tumor discovered in his brain. Dr. Coleman de Chenard performed the autopsy and concluded that the tumor could not have been the reason for his actions. But then Governor of Texas, John Connally, commissioned a task force to investigate further. The commission was composed of neurosurgeons, psychiatrists, pathologists, and psychologists, and the commission challenged his findings and, following a 3-hour hearing, concluded that he had erred. They found that the tumor had widespread areas of necrosis, and they stated, quote, "The relationship between the brain tumor and Whitman's actions cannot be established with clarity. However, the tumor conceivably could have contributed to his inability to control his emotions and actions." Forensic investigators have theorized that the tumor pressed against Whitman's amygdala, which is a part of the brain related to anxiety and fight or flight responses, among many, many other functions. Kathy Whitman was laid to rest in her hometown of Needville, Texas. Margaret was laid to rest in Florida alongside Charles. In 1967, $5,000 was spent to repair all the bullet holes and damage caused by the attack, but the observation deck was closed in 1974. It was declared permanently closed in 1976 by the University of Texas Regents. In 1988, Larry Faulkner, then president of the university, announced the observation deck would be reopened. He asked the Board of Regents to support the opening, which they did. In September of 1999, it was reopened. There are security guards stationed in various areas of the tower. The trauma from this event resonated throughout the country. A memorial was erected to honor those who lost their lives and were injured that day. And those names are Thomas Ashton, 22, Claudia Rutt, 18, Robert Boyer, 22, Paul Sontag, 18. So many of these people are so young. I mean, it was at a college, but baby boy Wilson, unborn son of survivor Claire Wilson. Roy Schmidt, 29. Martin Gabor, 16, or Mark Gabor, 16. I've seen it both ways in different articles. Thomas Ekman, 18. Marguerite Lamport, 45. Police officer Billy Speed, 24. Karen Griffith, 17. Edna Townsley, we do not have her age. David Gunby, 23. He died in 2001 at the age of 58, but his death was ruled a homicide from injuries that he received when he was shot. So these were things that were complications from his injuries of the shooting. Harry Walchuk, 38. Thomas Carr, 24. Kathy Whitman, 23. And Margaret Whitman, 43. Oh, man. That's rough. But I don't know. I don't know. What do you guys think? He saw a psychiatrist and he said, I want to go to the top of that tower and I want to pick people off with a rifle. And what in the actual fuck did he do? That's exactly what he did. I mean, it's tough. And then the brain tumor, I don't know, man. That's tough. That's somebody who honestly was crying out for help. The story is just really sad all the way around. And then look how many people were victims. And those names are the people that passed away. So many more were injured in a really big way. So, just terrible. As always, let me know what you guys think, and I'll catch you next week. Love you. Bye. If you like this episode, be sure to like this episode and follow the show so that you never miss out on new episodes. Get in on the conversation on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us at Killer Queens Pod, or you can join our Facebook discussion group at Killer Queens Podcast, where we discuss cases covered on the show and all things 90s. If you want to submit a case to be covered on the show, visit killerqueenspodcast.com/case submission and just complete the form. And if we cover the case, we'll give you a shout out on the show. Lilas.